This week we have two great writers on tap. Both writers are associated with the modernist period in American literature, and the modernist period can usually be dated or marked basically between, say, 1915, 1917, to the beginning of the Second World War. So 1917 to 1941 is typically where we um, mark the dates for the modernist period. And Fitzgerald and Hemingway are two of the leading American writers during this time, particularly in their genre of short fiction and the novel form. And the stories that we will read this week, Babylon Revisited by F. Scott Fitzgerald and Big Two-Hearted River by Ernest Hemingway, are wonderful stories in a unit such as the one we're currently studying now, with respect to ideas of order and codes of conduct. You will see, if we read carefully and we think about the characters in these stories, you'll see each of them possessing the desire to control their immediate circumstances by adhering to a code, or ordering their world in a way that makes sense for them and gives them a sense of control amid chaos. Well, if we were in class, I would just point out a couple of um, points made on this slide and talk a little bit with you about his upbringing, which was Midwestern, hailing from St. Paul, Minnesota. F. Scott Fitzgerald came from a family that enjoyed great privilege and a relative amount of social distinction. On his father's side of the family, he descended from Francis Scott Key. If you don't know who that is, you can Google it, and then you'll go, oh, I know who that is. And then on his mother's side of the family, he inherited, or I should say, was raised privileged due to the enormous amount of familial wealth the family had amassed. He was educated and attended at Princeton University. He wrote for the University magazine and then began publishing poems and stories in the Nassau Literary Magazine. In the fall of 1917, Fitzgerald gets his commission into the United States Army. World War I is underway. He begins writing what will become the novel This Side of Paradise. When he is transferred to Camp Sheridan outside Montgomery, Alabama, Fitzgerald meets and falls instantly in love with the debutante, the lovely 18-year-old Zelda Sayer, who is the daughter of an Alabama Supreme Court judge. He is discharged from the Army on February 19th, just narrowly missing being deployed into what was a World War I coming to its close. He goes to work for an advertising agency in New York. He and Zelda ultimately marry in St. Patrick's Cathedral on April 3rd of 1920, and their life, the relationship that they have, which was marked by its tumultuous and oftentimes violent and drunken uh, outbursts, certainly embellished what Fitzgerald and others referred to as the Jazz Age. It was the Roaring Twenties, World War One, just in the rear view mirror, the decade that lay out in front of them was one marked by extraordinary wealth, extraordinary exuberance, extraordinary a decay, I should say, in and a loosening of the morals in American society. So Fitzgerald's novel, This Side of Paradise, was a great success, and it established Fitzgerald as a serious novelist, one to be contended with. Fitzgerald nevertheless expressed social and psychological tensions of his life in his novels and his short fiction. Um, we see this perhaps best in what many people consider to be the greatest novel of the 20th century, The Great Gatsby. Foremost among these novels is a romantic sense of American history as the most beautiful history in the world, the history of all aspiration, not just the American dream, but the human dream. Yet Fitzgerald tempered the romantic in him with a skeptic's cold eye, and Nick Carraway, the narrator of The Great Gatsby, declares that Gatsby's dream is dead, not only personally, but historically, back into the vast obscurity where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. If you want to read beautiful prose, read the last 2 or 3 pages of um, the Great Gatsby. I cannot think of any finer language. The way that Fitzgerald could put together his words into these beautifully fluid sentences was just remarkable. So stylistically different than a Hemingway, but yet both writers are still so powerful for their contributions in American literature. With a disillusionment of the idealist, Fitzgerald embraces the sense that life is essentially a cheat and its conditions are those of defeat, and that the redeeming things are not happiness and pleasure, but the deeper satisfactions that come out of struggle. I apologize for the extra period there. Some random photos of F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda through the years. Zelda suffered greatly from mental disorder, mental illness, and she was institutionalized multiple times. And her fate is a tragic one. Fitzgerald, this is in the end of their relationship. Fitzgerald is living in Hollywood at this point and attempting to write screenplays for Hollywood, which was in its golden age at that period. And Zelda had been institutionalized in an asylum in North Carolina, and that asylum caught on fire one night, and Zelda perished in that fire. Fitzgerald and Zelda were known for their excess in alcohol and drugs, and Fitzgerald, when he was on his game, could drink a fifth of vodka a day and 30 bottles of beer when he was putting a bender on. That's a lot of booze. He ultimately dies. I think I have to check his dates, but he essentially drinks himself to death, and he dies at, I think, the age of 44. So let's talk a little bit about this delightful story that we have, Babylon Revisited. Fitzgerald was commissioned to write the story, contracted with the Saturday Evening Post he earned $4,000, the highest sum that he ever received for a magazine story. He also sold the story to a Hollywood movie company and worked on a script, but the film was never produced. Some things to be on the lookout for as we read through Babylon Revisited. Fitzgerald's story presents several interesting ideas regarding belief system and ideas of order. First among these is the presence of the past in the present, and we see this on page 1149. This is a belief system. This idea that the past is in the past is rather naive, especially for modernist writers like Fitzgerald and Faulkner and Hemingway and others, because this is a story where the past intrudes time and time again into Charlie's present. And you can see this, how it does this, numerous times throughout the story. It does it through characters in Charlie's past that intrude, his past actions, his past behavior, from his life in Paris when he's there initially. Uh, so this idea is a system that is being challenged. That the notion, let me put it simply, the notion that the past is time that has an action that occurs in the past, and then we leave it there. This is a story that challenges that belief system. Faulkner will do one better and say that the past is never dead. Faulkner will write in Requiem for a Nun that the past is never really dead. It's never even past. The concept of dissipation and the notion of dissipation on page 1148, we could talk at great length about that, especially right now in this world that we're living now. The whole concept of things that we believed to be stable, uh, the stock market, right? My 401k, our health, the economy. Um, how is it that in the matter of just a few weeks, all of these things that we believed, ordered, and gave systems and constructs and a framework for the way we viewed our reality have dissipated? They've just disappeared. And Fitzgerald is intrigued by this concept in this story. The potential for redemption and change. Lots of people believe or adhere to a system of belief that says people can't change or people can't redeem themselves, or conversely, that they can. And this is very much a story that um, uh, explores this concept or this system of belief. To what extent can we redeem ourselves? To what extent can Charlie truly come back? Charlie Wales truly come back and reclaim his honor, or Honoria, his daughter? Right? We're invited to view her symbolically or allegorically, aren't we? We might want to look at the idea or the notion of money, material uh, things, as seen on page 1158. We might look at and discuss Charlie's code of conduct. Where does it originate? When and how is it tested? What is Charlie's code of conduct after he has reformed and is trying to put his life back together? His code of conduct includes taking one drink a day. That's what he allows himself. Um, and it is certainly tested multiple times throughout this story. And then ultimately at the end, he is tested, isn't he? Realizes that he will be unsuccessful in getting his daughter back. Let's consider Charlie Wales a little bit, a great character in Fitzgerald's short fiction. Charlie Wales is a man who has reformed himself or is in the process of rebuilding and reforming himself, but he is plagued and haunted by his past, which is represented concretely by Duncan and Lorraine, whom he cannot escape despite his efforts. As readers, we follow Charlie through the streets of Paris, wondering if he's truly reformed. The final scene at the bar we might consider his ultimate test. He proves his self-discipline in every regard. Alcohol, as we've already mentioned, he takes one drink a day. Sex, he does not accept the overtures by the prostitute or Lorraine, and his temperament with Marion, right? Marion is the antagonist in this story, and he resists exploding in outrage and anger when Marion denies him his daughter. Although he cannot reclaim Honoria, he has reclaimed his honor, and he can have every confidence that he will regain his daughter at the end of the 6 months. At least that's how the story is left, right? We think that um, that Charlie will. We're hopeful, I think, at the end that Charlie will, in fact, be reunited and have sole custody of his daughter. Charlie's epiphany. You remember what an epiphany is a sudden insight, a brief glimpse into reality. And Charlie certainly has an epiphany, a realization in Montmartre. Charlie, quote, suddenly realized the meaning of the word dissipate. This is an important epiphany for Charlie. And we might ask, what does Charlie's realization suggest about him? And why is it crucial to his reform? Let's talk a little bit about Marion. This is Charlie's sister-in-law. Marion functions really as the antagonist in the story. Uh, as far as the plot goes, Marion needs to be assured of Charlie's reform, but as readers, we may ask rather fairly, I think, is she more concerned with Honoria, who, if we think about it, really prefers her uncle to Marion, or some kind of revenge on Charlie? Clearly, Marion is spiteful. She resents Charlie's wealth, his past, and his present, and his and her sister's lavish lifestyle, especially back in the day, which really stood as a marked contrast between the financial struggles that Marion had living with her husband. And this is during those expatriate days of Americans living in Paris, who were living in with extraordinarily wealthy, luxuriant lives as the stock market was booming in the 1920s. Of course, we know what happens at the end of that decade, right? The stock market crashes. And so we see Charlie living luxuriously before the crash and then after the crash. And if we read carefully, we can see that the crash means functions symbolically too, right? I mean, it's the stock market crash, but it's also the personal crash of Charlie and how his life has just become shattered through the excesses and of alcohol, drugs, uh, and just careless, raucous living, right? But if we think about Marion's thoughts and actions, when they have the confrontation at her apartment, she takes ill when it's convenient for her and cannot be disturbed. To help her argument, she calls up her sister's memory, even though they were never really that close, and she overreacts to Duncan and Lorraine so as to carry out her revenge on Charlie. Her triumph then seems at least temporary at best. Honoria. This is Charlie's precocious daughter living with his in-laws while Charlie tries to put his life back together, right? The name, as we've already sort of indicated, is symbolic, isn't it? Charlie returns to Paris for not just his daughter, but more importantly, his honor, which he does regain. Fitzgerald said that he conceived Honoria as being 8 or 9 years old. He made her precocious to avoid sentimentalizing the child in the story. The story would be radically different if she were a clingy child. And for the film version he planned, Fitzgerald was adamant that he did not want a dying speech of little Eva or less credible children of Charles Dickens type fiction. They, according to Fitzgerald, ring false upon the modern ear. And though they make certain sections of the audience weep, they revolt and alienate the intelligent section of the audience. So this is a story that highlights the double Paris. Consider the contrast evoked in the story between the Paris as it existed for Charlie and his wife when they were these wealthy expatriates, not wholly unlike F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Fitzgerald, and Depression Paris, which we see in the present tense of the story, with its decadently muted nightlife and prevailing sense of melancholy. As you read through this story, though, be reading it through the lens of the systems of belief that are challenged. For example, material, substantive things provide stability and comfort and order to us, and contrast that with the dissipation that occurs when the great wealth just vanishes like that overnight, seemingly, right? It truly does challenge the individual's sense of stability and order. The whole concept of redemption and transformation. Can we truly redeem ourselves? And the code of conduct that Charlie demonstrates as he puts together the fragmented past of his life and uh, trying to get his stuff together, so to speak, so that he can have a life again and move forward with his daughter. And how he demonstrates that through not completely abstaining from alcohol, but by allowing himself to have the one drink